Edward Ted Scott. He was many things: the head of the Anglican Church in Canada, also called the primate of the Anglican Church, father, humanitarian, anti-apartheid activist, women's and First Nations advocate, progressive in his field, and my great-grandfather. He felt responsible to make things better for people. Much of the information about his life in this documentary was given from the interview held with Pat Robinson, Scott's daughter and my grandmother. Unless you research the Anglican Church or Nelson Mandela, you likely do not know him, but this documentary will change that. Scott was born in Edmonton, Alberta on April 30th, 1916, and became an ordained Anglican priest in 1943. His father was an Anglican rector, which is like an administrative leader for the church. Ted's son-in-law is also an Anglican priest. Interesting fact, this means that my great-great-grandfather, great-grandfather, and grandfather were all Anglican priests. My father decided to break the streak, become an artist and picture framer instead. Due to his compassion and hard work to help others, he gained more responsibilities, was elected the primate of the Anglican Church in 1971. He received many honors, including the Order of Canada, the United Nations Pearson Peace Award. According to the interview I had with my grandmother about Scott, she said he was a very warm person, who rarely got upset with them when they were young. She also said her dad enjoyed solving puzzles and buying things and building things. He also didn't talk much about his accomplishments with his 4 children. They did not know about him joining the Commonwealth Group of Eminent Persons in the 80s to help bring an end to apartheid in South Africa. Ted Scott tragically later died in a car accident in Ontario on June 21st, 2004. After the death, there are many dignitaries who attended his funeral, had respect for all of his good works to help others, like former Prime Minister Joe Clark, Governor General Adrian Clarkson, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who gave a eulogy. The Pope couldn't attend, said his most senior representative Mandela also couldn't attend, but sent a personal letter that was read at the funeral. The other Christian leaders and First Nations leaders arrived too. The funeral was held at St. James Cathedral in downtown Toronto and was packed. Seating and audio were set up outside the church for those who weren't able to get in. Many know of Nelson Mandela, the first black president in South Africa, known for his anti-apartheid stance, which then caused a subsequent imprisonment for 27 years. Some may not know that he had many connections with religious institutions, including the Anglican Church of Canada. During his imprisonment, Mandela reportedly saw the cruelty of other human beings, so he and many others in the prison turned to religion to maintain some hope in their dire circumstances. Many religious groups rallied for the release of the political prisoners in Pollsmoor Prison, including the Canadian Anglican Church, which was being rallied by many members, including the head of the church at the time, Primate Ted Scott. At the year of 1986, Scott was chosen as a representative for Canada, the Commonwealth Group of Eminent Persons, which was founded by the Commonwealth of Nations to investigate apartheid in South Africa. The Commonwealth Group of Eminent Persons was sent on to quite close at this time, as Scott. The Commonwealth Group of Eminent Persons went on to recommend economic sanctions against the South African regime. Mandela and Scott were quite close at this time, as Scott visited Mandela in Pollsmoor Prison and had critical meetings with him. Scott was also one of the people who first welcomed Mandela to being a free man. Mandela was aware of Scott's efforts against apartheid and called him a great defender of the rights of all, a beacon in the struggle against racism everywhere. Scott also created a fund called the Nelson Mandela Fund, so Canadians can assist in advancing dialogue and change with South Africa. What is an individual's responsibility to be part of the solution, create change? It's quite a question, an important question for Ted Scott. Not only did he work to help end apartheid, but he also advocated for women to be allowed to become Anglican priests. See, before the 1970s, many women were not allowed to be ordained in the Anglican Church. To be ordained is to become a priest or minister in the church of your following. In the foreword of his biography, Radical Compassion, The Life and Times of Archbishop Ted Scott, my grandfather wrote about his work to help women become clergy. When I was primate, some clergy and laity threatened the church with secession when he first proposed ordaining women priests. Few did leave, but we stayed together. When our first women bishops were consecrated, there were many more rumblings, especially overseas. Nothing serious came of it. At the time he wrote this, my grandfather was disappointed in the church for being against LGBTQ people in the clergy, just like they had been against women in the clergy years ago when he fought for women to be priests. Scott also advocated for the First Nations people as well. Back in the 1960s to 70s, the First Nations people were being very mismanaged and lacked clean water, electricity, and housing budgets, so Scott decided to help change that. He helped by advocating for the First Nations people stop being mismanaged by the government and for there to be more First Nations representation in the Canadian government. All this help to their people made Ted Scott very well respected amongst the First Nations people, to the point where Scott was given a poncho made with all the symbols of the First Nations, the first and only kind of poncho like that made by the First Nations people. He also received the Order of the Buffalo, a great honor. All this collaboration with humanitarian causes awarded Scott the United Nations Pearson Peace Medal in 1988. All of this showed that Ted Scott did see that it was his responsibility to be part of the solution, create change, to help those in need. Conclusion. After speaking with my grandmother and researching my great-grandfather's accomplishments from online articles and his biography, it's clear that he was a person who felt it was his responsibility to make change that would be beneficial to others. His work to help end apartheid, improve conditions for the First Nations people, allow women to be members of the clergy, as well as the hundreds of his parishioners he helped individually as their priest. All of this shows that it's how hard he worked to make positive changes to help others. In the book about his life, Radical and Compassion, The Life and Times of Archbishop Ted Scott, written by Hugh McCollum, Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote about an African saying called Mbutu, which means gentleness, compassion, hospitality, openness to others, vulnerability, and being available for others, recognizing all others as persons. Archbishop Tutu said, "My dear friend Ted Scott knew all about Mbutu long before he ever heard the word, for he lives it daily."